The Nevada sun beat down on Nellis Air Force Base with the kind of merciless intensity that turned aircraft hangars into ovens and made even seasoned pilots grateful for the shade of a wing. It was 6:30 hours on a Tuesday morning, and the flight line buzzed with the controlled energy of another training day at one of America's premier fighter pilot schools. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete, and the distant roar of jet engines provided a constant soundtrack to the ballet of military precision unfolding across the tarmac. Master Sergeant Diana Chen moved through her morning routine with the methodical calm of someone who had performed these same tasks thousands of times before. At 54, she was older than most of the pilots she served. Her black hair now streaked with silver and pulled back in the regulation bun that had been her signature for over 2 decades. Her flight suit was faded from countless wash cycles, the fabric soft and comfortable in a way that only came from years of honest wear. The name tape across her chest read simply Chen, with no flashy squadron patches or decorative elements that younger airmen often favored. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of a master craftsman, someone who understood that excellence was measured not in appearance but in performance. Her toolbox was worn but immaculately organized, each instrument in its proper place, each surface clean and ready for use. This was her domain, her responsibility, and she approached it with the kind of professional pride that had become increasingly rare in a military culture obsessed with image and advancement. The morning's assignment was routine: pre-flight inspection of aircraft 847 own F-16C Fighting Falcon that had been assigned to the Advanced Training Squadron. It was an older model, one of the workhorses of the fleet, not as sleek or modern as the newer variants, but reliable and proven in countless missions around the world. To most people, it was just another gray fighter jet. To Diana Chen, it was a complex system of interconnected components, each one critical to the safety of the pilot who would trust his life to its performance. She began her inspection at the nose, running her hands along the aircraft's skin with the sensitivity of a doctor examining a patient. Her fingers traced panel lines, checked fasteners, tested the integrity of surfaces that would soon be subjected to forces that could tear apart anything less than perfect. Her eyes missed nothing: the slight discoloration that might indicate metal fatigue, the tiny gap that could signal a loose connection, the almost imperceptible irregularity that might become a catastrophic failure at 30,000 feet. It was during this meticulous examination that Captain Bradley Morrison decided to make his entrance. Morrison was everything that military public relations officers dreamed of when they imagined the ideal fighter pilot: tall, confident, with the kind of square jaw and easy smile that looked perfect in recruitment posters. At 32, he was young enough to still believe in his own invincibility, but experienced enough to have earned the respect of his peers through genuine skill in the cockpit. He commanded Alpha Flight, 12 of the brightest and most promising pilot candidates in the Air Force, and he never let anyone forget it. Morrison approached with his usual entourage of eager students trailing behind him like ducklings following their mother. They were the cream of the crop, graduates of the Air Force Academy with test scores that read like lottery numbers and enough natural talent to make flying look effortless. They wore their confidence like cologne, heavy and impossible to ignore. To them, the base was their playground, and everyone else was merely supporting cast in the drama of their ascension to fighter pilot glory. "Well, well," Morrison announced as he spotted Diana conducting her inspection, his voice carrying the theatrical projection that instructors use when they want to ensure their audience doesn't miss a single word. "What do we have here, gentlemen? Looks like our maintenance crew is being extra thorough this morning." Diana continued her work without acknowledging the comment. She had moved to the aircraft's left wing, checking the integrity of the weapon pylons with the kind of focused attention that suggested this particular inspection was more critical than routine. Her silence wasn't rudeness, it was professionalism. She was working, and work required concentration. But Morrison interpreted her lack of response as an opportunity for instruction. "Notice, class, how some people approach their duties with what they might call attention to detail, but what we in the cockpit recognize as excessive caution. When you're trained to think at the speed of sound, you learn to make decisions quickly and trust your instincts." The young pilots chuckled appreciatively, though a few seemed uncertain about whether they were supposed to be laughing at the older sergeant, who was clearly taking her job seriously. Diana remained focused on her checklist, running through each item with the same methodical precision she had employed for 23 years of active duty. Morrison stepped closer, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering what he considered profound wisdom. "The difference between military excellence and civilian adequacy," he continued, "is that we're trained to operate under pressure, to make life or death decisions in seconds, while others have the luxury of taking their time with routine tasks." Diana completed her wing inspection and moved to the aircraft's tail section. Her movements were economical, waste-free, each action serving a specific purpose in the complex dance of ensuring airworthiness. She checked control surfaces, examined hydraulic lines, tested the integrity of components that most people would never notice, but which could mean the difference between a successful mission and a tragic accident. From his office window, for stories above the flight line, Colonel Robert Westbrook watched the scene unfold with growing unease. Westbrook was a pilot's pilot, a man who had earned his Eagles through 3 decades of service that included combat tours in places that still didn't officially exist on any map. He had the kind of seasoned judgment that came from seeing enough action to recognize both genuine competence and dangerous arrogance when they crossed paths. What bothered Westbrook wasn't Morrison's casual condescension toward an enlisted maintainer that was unfortunately common enough in an officer corps that sometimes forgot where their aircraft came from. What concerned him was Morrison's timing. Diana Chen wasn't conducting a routine inspection. Westbrook knew from the morning briefing that aircraft 847 had been flagged for a special maintenance review following some unusual readings from its last flight. The fact that Morrison was using this particular moment for his impromptu lesson in supposed superiority suggested a level of operational ignorance that could be dangerous. Westbrook had worked with Diana Chen for 18 months. Ever since her transfer to Nellis from her previous assignment at a classified facility that didn't appear on any organizational chart, her personnel file was mostly redacted, but what he could read was impressive enough. What he had observed, personally, was even more remarkable. She understood them at a level that bordered on the mystical. She could diagnose problems that sophisticated diagnostic equipment missed, and she could fix things that engineering manuals said were impossible to repair. But Morrison knew none of this. To him, Diana was simply an aging enlisted maintainer, a convenient prop for his lesson about the superiority of officer training and pilot instincts. He was about to discover that assumptions, especially in military aviation, could be more dangerous than enemy fire. "Tell me, Sergeant," Morrison called out, his tone taking on a sharper edge as Diana's continued silence began to irritate him. "How long does it usually take to polish one airplane? We've got a training mission scheduled, and frankly, we're on a tight timeline here." Diana finally looked up from her inspection, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's with the kind of steady calm that comes from facing much more serious challenges than an impatient pilot. She didn't speak immediately, instead taking a moment to finish recording her findings on the inspection checklist clipped to her toolbox. "Aircraft will be ready when it's safe, Captain," she replied, her voice carrying just enough emphasis on the word safe to make clear her priorities. Not before, Morrison's jaw tightened at what he perceived as insubordination disguised as procedure. This was exactly the kind of encounter he had hoped for, a perfect teaching moment about the chain of command and the importance of decisive leadership. He was about to deliver what he considered a masterful lesson in military hierarchy when the morning's routine was shattered by an emergency that would change everything. The emergency klaxon that erupted across Nellis Air Force Base at 0647 hours was the kind of sound that made even veteran personnel stop whatever they were doing and listen. It was followed immediately by a radio transmission that sent ice through the veins of everyone on the flight. Line, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Viper 23 declaring an in-flight emergency. We have complete hydraulic system failure. Landing gear will not deploy. Repeat, landing gear will not deploy." The voice belonged to Second Lieutenant Jake Martinez, a promising young pilot on only his 15th solo flight in the F-16. The panic in his transmission was barely controlled. The kind of fear that comes when theoretical emergency procedures suddenly become life-or-death reality. In the background of his transmission, everyone could hear the distinctive whine of jet engines and the electronic warning tones that indicated multiple system failures. Captain Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the voice. Martinez was one of his students, a kid from Texas, with natural flying ability and the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Morrison of his own early days in the cockpit. The thought of losing him to a mechanical failure was both professionally devastating and personally heartbreaking. Tower Viper 23. Martinez's voice crackled over the radio again, his words coming faster now as stress began to override his training. I have tried the manual gear extension 3 times. Nothing's happening. The backup hydraulic system is showing 0 pressure. I am running low on fuel, and I don't know what else to try. Across the flight line, organized chaos erupted with military precision. Crash trucks roared to life here, red lights flashing as they positioned themselves along the runway. Fire suppression teams checked their equipment one final time, knowing that a belly landing gif, that's what it came to would, likely result in sparks, friction, and the very real possibility of an aircraft fire. In the control tower, senior controllers were already running through emergency checklists, while radio operators coordinated with civilian emergency services. Diana Chen heard the transmission while she was still inspecting aircraft 847, her hands deep in an engine compartment checking fuel line connections. For most people, the emergency would have been a distraction from their assigned duties. For Diana, it was a call to a different kind of duty entirely. She straightened up, set down her inspection tools with characteristic care, and began walking toward the operations building with the steady and hurried pace of someone who had faced similar crises before. Morrison was already moving, his instructor persona temporarily forgotten as genuine concern for his student took over. I need to get to the tower, he announced to his class. Martinez is one of ours, and I need to talk him through this. But Diana's path intersected his before he could reach the building. Captain, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with surprising authority. That aircraft, what's its maintenance history? Morrison stopped, irritation flashing across his features. Even in the middle of an emergency, he couldn't quite suppress his annoyance at being questioned by an enlisted maintainer. Sergeant, I appreciate your concern, but this is a flight operations issue now. The ground crew's job is done. Diana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. It was a subtle transformation, like watching a sleeping predator suddenly become alert. Captain, I asked you a question. What's the maintenance history on Viper 23? The tone of her voice was still respectful, still professional, but it carried an undertone of authority that made Morrison hesitate. There was something in her demeanor that suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry from a concerned ground crew. Remember, this was a technical expert asking for information that might be critical to solving a life-threatening problem. It's a Block 50 variant, Morrison replied, his voice slightly uncertain. Pretty standard configuration. Martinez has been flying it for 2 weeks without any issues. Block 50, Diana repeated, and Morrison could see her mentally processing information at a speed that suggested deep familiarity with aircraft systems. That means it has the upgraded hydraulic distribution system, the one with the bypass valve. Near the main gear, well, Morrison stared at her, suddenly realizing that this aging sergeant knew technical details about his aircraft that he had never bothered to learn. How do you know about the bypass valve? Diana was already moving toward the radio equipment in the nearby maintenance shed, her pace still controlled, but with a new sense of purpose that commanded attention. Because I helped design it, she said simply, as if she were discussing whether. She reached the radio console and adjusted the frequency to the emergency channel. Her movements were precise, economical, the actions of someone who had operated communication equipment under much more stressful circumstances than a training base emergency. When she keyed the microphone, her voice was calm, authoritative, and completely devoid of the panic that was beginning to infect other radio transmissions. Viper 23. This is ground control. I need you to stop trying the manual gear extension. You're making the problem worse. Martinez's voice came back immediately, confusion mixing with desperation. Ground control, who is this? That's not standard procedure. I'm supposed to keep trying the manual extension until. Lieutenant, listen to me very carefully, Diana interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stop arguing and start paying attention. Your aircraft has a design flaw in the hydraulic bypass system. Every time you cycle the manual extension, you're creating more pressure in a system that's already compromised. You need to stop before you cause a complete hydraulic lock. In the tower, controllers were frantically trying to figure out who was giving unauthorized instructions to an aircraft in distress. But Colonel Westbrook, who had been monitoring the situation from his office, was already moving. He had recognized Diana's voice, and more importantly, he had recognized the level of technical expertise in her assessment. This wasn't some ground crew member improvising solutions. This was someone who understood the aircraft's systems at a level that even the manufacturer's engineers might envy. Morrison stood frozen beside the radio console, watching Diana take control of an emergency situation with a competence that was both humbling and terrifying. Everything he thought he knew about chain of command, about the roles and capabilities of different personnel, was being rewritten in real time. Asterisk Viper 23, Diana continued, her voice maintaining that same supernatural calm. I want you to listen very carefully to my instructions. We're going to use the aircraft's own momentum to unlock the gear system. But it's going to require precise timing and some maneuvers that aren't in any manual you've studied. Ma single quotes am. I don't understand, Martinez replied, his voice cracking slightly. Are you saying there's a way to get the gear down? There's always a way, son, Diana replied, and Morrison could hear decades of experience in those 4 words. But first, I need you to tell me your current altitude, airspeed, and fuel remaining. As Martinez provided the requested information. Diana was already calculating solutions with the kind of mental agility that suggested she had faced similar problems before. Morrison found himself leaning closer. Despite his confusion and growing concern about protocol violations, whatever Diana Chen was doing, she was doing it with a level of confidence that was impossible to ignore. All right, Lieutenant, Diana said after a moment of calculation. Here's what we're going to do. I need you to initiate a controlled slip to the left rudder, right aileron, just like you practiced in basic flight training. But I want you to hold it longer than normal, and I want you to let the aircraft settle into the maneuver. Ma'am, that's going to put significant stress on the airframe, Martinez replied, his training warring with his desperation. Trust me, Diana said, and there was something in her voice that made the words feel like a promise rather than a request. The stress you're worried about is exactly what we need. The hydraulic system in your aircraft responds to GI forces in a very specific way. We're going to use physics to fix what mechanics couldn't. Morrison watched in fascination as Diana guided the young pilot through a series of maneuvers that seemed to defy everything he had learned about emergency procedures. She was treating the F-16 not as a machine, following predetermined protocols, but as a living system that could be and persuaded into proper function through the right combination of knowledge and technique. Now I want you to snap back to level flight, Diana instructed, hard and fast. Don't ease into it, make the aircraft feel the change. Through the radio, they could hear the strain in Martinez's voice as he fought G-forces and fear in equal measure. Roger, executing now. The seconds that followed felt like hours. Morrison found himself holding his breath, along with every other person monitoring the emergency frequency. In the distance, they could see the tiny speck of the F-16 against the desert sky, performing maneuvers that looked almost violent to outside observers. Then Martinez's voice returned, and for the first time since the emergency began, it carried hope instead of panic. Ground control, I'm showing 1 green light. Nose gear appears to be down and locked. Diana's response was immediate and precise. Excellent. Now we're going to repeat the procedure for your main gear. This time, slip to the right, and I want you to really commit to the maneuver. The main gear system needs more persuasion than the nose gear. Morrison stood mesmerized as Diana continued her impossible coaching session, using radio instructions to perform what amounted to remote aircraft surgery. She was treating a multi-million-dollar fighter jet like a patient on an operating table, diagnosing problems and prescribing solutions with the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught in any school. 2 green lights, Martinez reported after the second maneuver, his voice now carrying genuine excitement. Main gear is down and locked. Outstanding, Diana replied, her tone still professionally calm, but with a note of satisfaction that suggested this outcome had never been in doubt. Now bring it home, Lieutenant. Nice and easy." As the F-16 lined up for its approach, Morrison realized that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. An aircraft that should have been lost, a pilot who should have faced the terrifying prospect of a belly landing, had been saved by an aging sergeant with a radio and an understanding of physics that bordered on genius. Colonel Westbrook appeared beside them. Having moved from the operations building with the purposeful stride of a commanding officer who had finally seen enough, his face was grim, but not with concern for the aircraft. Martinez was clearly going to land safely. His expression was that of a man who is about to deliver some uncomfortable truths to people who desperately needed to hear them. The F-16 touched down on runway 21 with the kind of gentle precision that made it look like a routine training landing. Rather than the successful conclusion of a near-catastrophic emergency, Lieutenant Martinez had followed Diana's instructions perfectly, and the aircraft rolled to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles that were no longer needed. The young pilot climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, his face pale but alive. Saved by radio instructions from a woman he had never met, Colonel Westbrook waited until the aircraft was secure and Martinez was safely in the hands of the medical team before he turned his attention to the crowd that had gathered around Diana. Chen, Captain Morrison, stood among his students, his earlier confidence replaced by a confused mixture of gratitude and growing unease. He was beginning to understand that something significant had just happened, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about competence and authority. "Sergeant Chen," Westbrook said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet flight line with unmistakable command authority. "Step forward, please." Diana set down her radio headset with the same methodical care she applied to all her tasks. She walked toward the colonel with steady, unhurried steps, her posture but relaxed, showing neither pride nor defensiveness about what she had just accomplished. To her, apparently, saving a pilot's life was simply another day's work. Morrison watched this exchange with growing confusion. There was something in Colonel Westbrook's tone, something in his posture, that suggested this encounter was about more than commending good performance. The colonel was treating this aging sergeant with a level of formal respect that seemed disproportionate to her rank and position. "Ladies and gentlemen," Westbrook announced, his voice carrying to every person. "Within 50 yards, I want everyone to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." "Lieutenant Johnson," he called to his aide, a nervous young officer who had been trailing behind him with a tablet. "Computer, please access Master Sergeant Chun's personnel file and read the service summary aloud." Lieutenant Johnson's fingers flew over his tablet screen, but after a moment, his face went pale. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "most of her file is classified. I can only access basic information." "Read what you can access," Westbrook ordered, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Johnson cleared his throat nervously. "Master Sergeant Diana Chen, current assignment, Maintenance Operations, Nellis, Air Force Base. Previous assignments." He paused, squinting at his screen. "Sir, it just shows a series of project codes and facility designations. Skunkworks, Advanced Development Program, Edwards Air Force Base, Experimental Flight Test Center, Groom Lake Classified Operations Division." Morrison felt his stomach drop as he recognized those names. Every pilot in the Air Force knew about Skunk Works in Edwards. They were the legendary facilities where America's most advanced aircraft were designed and tested. Groom Lake was even more exclusive, so classified that its very existence was officially denied. These weren't assignments for ordinary maintenance personnel. These were postings for the absolute elite of aerospace engineering. "Continue reading," Lieutenant Westbrook said, his eyes never leaving Diana's face. "Service decorations," Johnson continued, his voice growing smaller with each item. "Air Force Achievement Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Air Force Commendation Medal with Valor Device. Meritorious Service Medal, and..." He stopped, staring at his screen in disbelief. "And what, Lieutenant? The Defense Superior Service Medal, sir? And something called the Presidential Unit Citation for Classified Operations." A murmur ran through the crowd of pilots and ground crew. The Defense Superior Service Medal was rarely awarded, reserved for individuals whose contributions to national security were both extraordinary and often invisible to the public. The Presidential Unit Citation for Classified Operations was even rare it meant. Diana had been part of missions so sensitive that their very existence might never be officially the woman he had been condescending to, with the service record being read aloud. This wasn't just an experienced maintainer. This was someone who had been trusted with America's most classified aerospace programs, someone whose expertise had been deemed critical to national security. But Westbrook wasn't finished with his revelation. "Lieutenant, what does the file show for her technical qualifications?" Johnson scrolled through the document, his expression growing more amazed with each line. "Master Aircraft, Mechanic Certification, Advanced Avionics Systems Specialist, Aircraft Test Program Graduate," and he paused again, looking at Westbrook for confirmation, before continuing. "Go ahead, Lieutenant. Lead Design Engineer for F-22 Emergency Flight Systems, Co-Developer of B-2 Stealth Bomber Hydraulic Backup Protocols, Senior Technical Advisor for Next Generation Fighter Development Program." The silence that followed was profound. Morrison felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted, as if everything he thought he understood about military hierarchy and expertise had been turned upside down. The woman he had been lecturing about the difference between military excellence and civilian adequacy was, in fact, one of the architects of modern American air superiority. Diana had designed the very systems that kept pilots alive when everything else failed. She had created the backup protocols that turned certain death into survivable emergencies. The emergency procedures that Morrison taught to his students had been written, at least in part, by the quiet sergeant he had been dismissing as overly cautious. Master Sergeant Chen Westbrook said formally, "Would you be willing to explain to these officers and airmen exactly how you knew Lieutenant Martinez's aircraft could be saved?" Diana looked at the assembled crowd, her gaze taking in each face with the same careful assessment she had applied to aircraft components. When she spoke, her voice was clear and confident, but completely free of ego or self-importance. "The Block 50 F-16 has a hydraulic system design that I worked on 12 years ago," she began. "There's a known issue with pressure buildup in the gear extension circuit when the primary hydraulic system fails completely. Most pilots don't know about it because it's not in the standard emergency procedures. The official solution requires landing the aircraft gear up and accepting the loss." Gestured toward the runway where Martinez's F-16 was being towed to safety. "But during development, we discovered that specific flight maneuvers could create enough G-force variation to reset the hydraulic pressure and allow the backup system to function. The procedure was never officially adopted because it requires perfect timing and considerable risk. But in a situation where the alternative is certain aircraft loss, it's worth attempting." Morrison found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual commanding tone. "Ma'am, if you developed these procedures, why aren't they in our training manuals?" Diana's expression softened slightly, as if she was explaining something to a promising but naive student. Captain Military Aviation is full of unofficial knowledge, techniques that work but can't be taught in a classroom setting. They require too much experience, too much intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior. They're the kind of solutions that can only be passed on from master to apprentice. From someone who has seen every possible failure mode to someone willing to learn. Colonel Westbrook stepped forward, his voice taking on the formal tone reserved for significant announcements. "Master Sergeant Chen has been conducting a classified assessment of our training protocols for the past 6 months. Her mission was to evaluate whether our current emergency procedures adequately prepare pilots for real-world system failures." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. He had been observed, evaluated, and found wanting by someone whose qualifications he was only beginning to understand. The casual arrogance he had displayed, the dismissive treatment of enlisted personnel, the assumption that rank equated to competence, all of it had been witnessed by someone whose expertise dwarfed his own. Based on today's events, Westbrook continued, "I think it's safe to say that our current training could use some enhancement. Master Sergeant Chen has agreed to develop a new curriculum that will teach our pilots not just how to fly their aircraft, but how to truly understand them." Diana picked up her inspection clipboard and pen, preparing to return to her assigned duties. But before she could leave, Morrison stepped forward, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. Master Sergeant, he said, struggling to find the right words. "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your rank and assignment, and those assumptions were completely wrong." Diana looked at him with the same calm assessment she had shown throughout the morning. "Captain, you saw an older enlisted Woman doing routine maintenance work. Based on available information, your assumptions were logical. But this is exactly why we need to change how we think about expertise and competence. She gestured toward the group of young pilots, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing amazement. These airmen will be flying missions where their lives depend on the knowledge and skills of ground crew members, air traffic controllers, intelligence analysts, and dozens of other specialists who will never wear pilot wings. The most dangerous assumption they can make is that the person with the highest rank or the most visible job is automatically the most qualified to solve their problems. Over the following months, Diana's presence at Nellis transformed from covert assessment to open mentorship. She developed a new training program that emphasized cross-functional understanding, teaching pilots to appreciate the expertise of the specialists who supported their missions. Her unofficial motto became standard wisdom on the base: every person you meet knows something you don't. Every job you see serves a purpose you might not understand. Every expert was once a beginner, but not every beginner will become an expert. The story of the quiet sergeant who saved Lieutenant Martinez became legendary throughout the Air Force. It was told in officer training schools as a cautionary tale about assumptions and arrogance. It was shared in maintenance hangars as an example of how technical expertise could emerge in the most unexpected moments. Most importantly, it became a reminder that competence doesn't announce itself with volume or swagger. It simply performs when performance matters most. Captain Morrison's teaching style underwent a complete transformation. He began bringing his students to maintenance briefings, encouraging them to ask questions of the ground crews, emphasizing that understanding their aircraft meant understanding every person who touched them. His former arrogance was replaced by a humility that made him not just a better instructor, but a better officer. Years later, when Morrison had earned his colonel's eagles and was commanding his own wing, he would tell Diana's story to every new class of pilots. He would emphasize that the quiet professional in the corner, the one who doesn't compete for attention or recognition, might be the person who saves your life when everything else fails. Master Sergeant Diana Chen eventually retired from active duty, but her influence lived on in the culture she had helped create. A culture that valued competence over charisma, that recognized expertise wherever it appeared, and that understood that true strength comes not from dominating others but from mastering your craft so completely that you can share that mastery. When it's needed most, the lesson she taught was simple but profound. Respect is earned through action, not demanded through rank. Excellence speaks for itself, and wisdom recognizes excellence regardless of the uniform it wears. In a world that often confuses noise with strength, the quiet professionals, the maintainers, the engineers, the specialists who keep complex systems running are the ones who hold everything together. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumptions, where hidden expertise emerges at critical moments, and where respect is earned through demonstrated excellence rather than demanded through position, subscribe to Hidden Sparks. Because the most important stories are often told by the people who never ask to be the center of attention.